This is a read-along graphic sample of the book entitled Darius, a Vampire Story, written by R. Shannon. It is a sample of book 1 of 5 from the series entitled Newport Vampire Story Series. There is a link below to purchase the book or the series at Amazon. Chapter 1. It was 9:30 at night, pitch dark, and the wind was howling. A storm was showing threatening signs on the horizon. It was September in Rhode Island, and the temperature was only 60 degrees. This was considered barely chilly in the Northeast. Charlie drove the company hearse to the back of the cemetery, away from any street lighting. Darius exited the passenger side of the hearse. Charlie, a vampire watcher, had already worked 12 hours at the funeral home embalming their next clients, and then overseeing a wake until 9 o'clock. He was already dog-tired, but Darius called on him to help with a little mishap he had during the early evening hours. As Charlie turned off the car and its headlights, he came around to the back of the hearse. As Darius opened the back doors, Charlie reached in and pulled out a shovel, a rake, and a pail. Darius reached back inside and pulled out a rolled blanket he had brought along and slung it over his shoulder. He then reached back inside and gathered Megan's limp body into his arms. Charlie did not engage Darius in any eye contact. Neither of them spoke. Charlie wasn't able to even look at his boss since Megan died 4 hours earlier. "Where did you bury Mrs. Jones this morning?" whispered Darius, breaking Charlie's train of thought. "Over here," whispered Charlie. On top of the cold, a slight drizzle began to fall. If they timed it right, they would finish burying Megan before the harder rain came. "Here it is, Darius," said Charlie. He dropped his bucket at the side of the burial site. Using his shovel, he carefully dug up and set aside a large part of the new sod that covered the fresh burial plot. The gravediggers buried Mrs. Jones 8 hours earlier, so the dirt would be easy to dig up. Usually Charlie was a nervous wreck when Darius got him involved in his cover-ups. For some reason, tonight, his mood was more despondent than normal. It was probably Megan's age, as she was still in her early 20s. This was not the first time Darius had overfed and killed one of his girls, as he sometimes referred to them. The calmness could have been the Xanax Charlie popped tonight. With the sod now removed, Charlie began to dig around the coffin. The fresh dirt was almost as easy as digging in sand. Digging enough room to place Megan next to Mrs. Jones's coffin was easy enough. What made it hard was Darius not keeping the light where Charlie needed it. He wouldn't dare say anything, as his boss could be temperamental at times like this. Darius put the flashlight down on the ground and wrapped Megan in the blanket he brought. Charlie continued to dig as best he could in the darkness, keeping his thoughts to himself. "I have got to get away from this guy. This is the third woman I've seen bled to death. He's completely out of control." As Charlie dug enough space to fit Megan into the hole, he stopped and moved aside. Darius picked Megan up in his arms, kissed her on her forehead, and passed her to Charlie. She was only 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed no more than 100 pounds. By passing Megan to him, Charlie knew Darius was having trouble facing what he did. Megan's death was a tragic accident, but it still happened at the hands of Darius. Charlie bent down and laid Megan into the grave. He used as much care and respect as one can use when illegally burying your boss's latest murder victim, although technically it was probably manslaughter. Maybe the offense he felt about Megan's burial was a residue of the Catholic schools he attended, or maybe it was his Christian grandmother hurling scriptures at him for every occasion when growing up. In any event, in spite of his criminal past and the madness he found himself in now, it was one shred of humanity that still clung to him. Darius had pulled him into a world of darkness he never knew existed, and Charlie was a seasoned criminal before falling into Darius's trap. "Darius, she'll probably rise in a day or two. What then?" whispered Charlie. "I'll be taking possession of the crematorium within a week, so I can take care of her when that happens." "What about in the meantime?" asked Charlie. "Just cover her up, Charlie. Let me do all the worrying. I've protected you so far, haven't I?" asked Darius, raising his voice. "Yes, Darius, you have." Charlie tossed the dirt back into the grave, covering Megan up. "So don't worry about anything. She may take a few days to rise. And in the meantime, I'll push the sale of the crematorium through as quickly as I can." "Okay, Darius," said Charlie. Once he filled the gravesite, he laid the shovel down. He picked up the sod pieces and laid them in place. "I'll keep my eyes open in the cemetery and the woods as I go walking," said Darius, thinking out loud. "Hopefully she will take time to recognize her full strength and desire." Darius glared at Charlie and waited for him to finish. Once he finished refilling the grave with dirt, Charlie walked on top of the sod, pressing it down until it looked exactly the same as when they arrived. Darius checked his watch, and it was only 2 o'clock in the morning. They drove back to the funeral home in silence. Charlie went to bed, and Darius went out walking like he did most nights. Chapter 2. Sierra Reagan clicked through to her social media pages, but there were no likes or comments anywhere. She felt terrible and scolded herself for being too wrapped up in social media. Then she clicked over to her sister's pages. She had comments from guys and girls she knew from school and even a few strangers. Sierra felt the all too familiar pain of loneliness. Why have I inherited this horrible fate? I'm almost as pretty as Genevieve. I should get some attention from someone. Something has gone terribly wrong. What's wrong with me? How could my life be so empty? She closed her laptop and went over and laid on her bed, staring at the ceiling as she did a lot. She thought back to when she told her mother she was convinced that her life was miserable and she was cursed in some way. Her mother told her Christians don't get cursed by evil. Their baptisms protect them. Somehow, even though her mother was fully confident and convinced, Sierra was not. This trap of loneliness she found herself in seemed unnatural. It seemed unfair, like a punishment, like a repayment for something evil. But she never did anything evil. She felt tears and a lump in her throat rising with these morbid thoughts. She quickly grabbed one of her many books that seemed to be her greatest comfort. "I don't have the energy for a crying jag right now," she thought. Luckily, this time she was able to distract herself with a book. John Luke's grandmother made his favorite meal, chicken parmesan, to wish him well on his long journey, which would begin in the morning. John Luke knew saying goodbye to his mother and grandmother would be hard, but he felt more emotional than he expected. "I think you may be acting too quickly, John Luke. Why don't you take advantage of the master's scholarship you've been offered first? Then you can test your calling," said his mother, Diane. It's not too late. You can call the monastery now and cancel. You made it through school, but you haven't given yourself a chance to test the real world yet, said Grandma Sandra. She placed the food on the table for the three of them. Throughout his school years, they were his biggest supporters. Grammar school was hard enough, but high school and college were even worse. Sometimes he was treated like an outcast. At other times, he was ignored completely. Either way, he felt invisible for much of his life. He graduated college 1 month earlier, and it felt like he was paroled from prison. His faith had sustained him all during those difficult years. He knew he wasn't particularly happy, but he did have the peace of Christ. All through dinner, they were double teaming him, and he was touched by it. He knew they had his best intentions in mind. John Luke's school years were brutal because he was extremely smart, quiet, and serious-minded. To say he didn't fit in anywhere in that world would be an understatement. His grandmother knew he was closer to her than anyone else in the world, but even she felt he was moving too quickly in entering the monastery. I'm going to the monastery and will discern my call for the 3 months between now and the time I need to fully accept or reject the scholarship. I can always cancel it if I decide to stay with the brothers, said John Luke. This is the time for me to do this. I'm relieved to hear that. So go there and get it out of your system, said his mother. John Luke knew she wanted grandchildren, and if he chose the priesthood or the brotherhood, that would end her own family dreams. But he knew he had to find his own way in the world. If his father had not run off years ago, he could have gotten an adult male's perspective on things, but that was not to be. His grandmother peppered their dinner conversation with tips on avoiding the monks' pressure to sign up too soon. They have shortages of brothers, so they will be coming at you like used car salesmen, said Sandra. You have to be ready for them. He finished his dinner, kissed the two most important women in his life goodbye, and he went to bed. His day-and-a-half bus and train journey from Florida to Newport, Rhode Island, would begin very early in the morning. Patrick Reagan sat with his wife Elizabeth in their Newport, Rhode Island home. This estate home had been inherited from 3 generations of Reagans before them. They were sitting in the drawing room, which was a throwback to another era. They were called great rooms in newer homes, but the Reagans were steeped in old world traditions, and it would always be a drawing room for them. They were part of a dying breed of pedigreed blue bloods who still ruled the Northeast. These traditions still meant something to them and their ilk. The whole blue blood thing, as some called it, was fading all around their world. But the Reagans were among what was left of old world money in Newport. They were clinging to what was left of their kingdom with white knuckles. Patrick, we are going to have help Sierra meet someone, as I am seeing signs of jealousy and depression in her, said Elizabeth. She always tried to catch him before the third or fourth brandy, as he could be too sarcastic and unpredictable by then. I think we should leave her alone. She seems happy to me, Elizabeth. Both of our daughters have told us to stop trying to fix them up, said Patrick. So you want your daughter to marry that scoundrel she brought around last week? No, I certainly do not. In light of that scoundrel, I see your point. But now you're talking about Genevieve. She has no trouble meeting young men. I thought you were talking about Sierra, said Patrick, frowning. We have to worry about both of them. Sierra is too quiet and reserved to meet anyone on her own. She has finished college, and she never had as much as one boyfriend, not even a date. I think she needs our help. What do you have in mind? Asked Patrick. The Langleys have 2 boys, Lawrence and Andrew. Either of them would be wonderful. but I think we should focus on Lawrence because he's quiet too. Andrew is outgoing, and I notice in church that he's quite popular with the girls. Lawrence is more reserved, like Sierra, said Elizabeth. I've been watching them on Sundays for about 2 months now. What is my part in this scheme? Asked Patrick. I want you to ask Douglas Langley, the father, if his son Lawrence has a girlfriend. That's all, said Elizabeth. That's easy enough, but if I sign on to this scheme of yours, what else will I have to do? What kind of small print am I not seeing that I need to worry about? Nothing. You will have to serve drinks at any dinner party his mother and I plan, said Elizabeth. That's all? There's no hidden step 3 that you're holding back? No, that's it. It's easy and simple, said Elizabeth, smirking. Okay, I'll find out if Lawrence has a girlfriend. I guess if he has a girlfriend, you want me to ask about Andrew? Asked Patrick as he took another sip of brandy. Exactly. You're a natural. I knew I could count on you, Patrick. Consider it done. Chapter 3. By the time he entered what was now his 4th train, John Luke had been traveling for a day and a half already. This was the last leg of his journey. As he entered the Amtrak train and walked a few rows back, he saw a section where only one man sat. He entered and sat down with his knapsack and smiled at the man across from him. The man did not smile back. He looked into John Luke's eyes and then looked away slowly. John Luke confirmed it was definitely a sneer, given with a sense of delight and glee. The man appeared European by his facial bone structure. He was tall, thin, and handsome. He had a full head of slicked back, dark brown hair and blue eyes. John Luke guessed he was probably from somewhere in Eastern Europe. The man's age was hard to judge. He could be in his late 20s or he could be in his mid-40s. It was impossible to tell. There was an agelessness about him. His dress and manner seemed foreign as well. John Luke sensed he was ignoring him on purpose, as their knees were only about a foot apart. John Luke was trying to think of how he would describe this guy if he had to. The word that came to him was dapper. The word itself was dated, and so was the guy's wardrobe. He wore a black suit, a white shirt, and a black and white print ascot with a gold and diamond tie pin. The piece de resistance that set the whole ensemble back in time was the black cape. It was resting loosely around his shoulders. He held his fedora in his lap. He also wore 2 gold rings on his right hand and a small gold bracelet. Yes, dapper was the right word. After about 10 minutes, John Luke removed his black overcoat, exposing his monk's robe, as well as a wooden cross pendant. Abbot Rene sent him the monk habit for his trip up to the monastery as part of his welcoming package. At the moment his coat came off, the dapper guy slowly sneered again. This time he also changed his seat to a 4-seat section directly across the aisle from John Luke. He joined 3 young women who had been sitting and talking together. This was not John Luke's first anti-Christian look, and it probably wouldn't be his last. Maybe Abbot Rene wanted him to get the full effect of being a cleric in today's world. He ignored what he took to be a snub, and he decided to read. The dapper guy became charming and animated around the girls. They were giggling after everything he said. John Luke watched as his ego inflated, and he took it all in. Why can't I be more social? Why am I so quiet or tongue-tied around women? I'm supposed to be giving up women soon, so why am I even thinking about this? He again tried to read. The social skills of this strange man continued to distract John Luke from his book. This covert surveillance continued for another 10 minutes when suddenly the train stopped. John Luke looked up and recognized this as his stop, Newport, Rhode Island. Glancing over at the strange man as he put on his coat, their eyes met. The strange man pulled a coin out of his pocket and flipped it high into the air with his thumb. On the way down, the coin stopped in midair for one split second of time before it continued to fall. As he caught the coin, he smirked at John Luke, turned on his heels, and left the train, laughing on his way out. The girls followed him like he was the Pied Piper. With a science degree, John Luke knew the coin stopping in midair was impossible, but he saw it with his own eyes. It had to have been some kind of black magic. Maybe this guy was a magician. That would explain the weird outfit. The train had been temperature controlled and comfortable. John Luke was not expecting the 45-degree gust of wind that snapped at him as he exited the train station. It was 9:30 at night and already dark. He was about 10 blocks from the monastery. He decided to walk as he had been sitting since his journey began earlier yesterday. It felt good to stretch and walk. The wind was howling and the coldness had a damp bite to it. Living in Florida all his life, this weather was a new sensation. Following the GPS on his cell phone, he turned left at the corner of Main Street. He walked down a side road, heading in the direction of the monastery. He walked along the road with an old cemetery on his left and a cobblestone road on his right. He supposed the dapper magician was dressed for this section of town. There were old oak trees along the tall black fencing inside the cemetery. The wind howled as it chilled him to the bone. He heard several dogs barking in the background. As he kept walking, a few crows cawed and flew quite close to him. He knew crows cawing at night was a sign of danger. He looked around, but he didn't see anything. The crows sat together on the cemetery fence, and he could have sworn they were watching him as he passed. He walked along the sidewalk next to the cemetery fence. The further down the side road he walked, the darker it became. There were fewer and fewer streetlights. The moonlight allowed him some level of visibility, but not much. It still felt good to be walking. He breathed in the cold air and watched the condensation coming out of his mouth. Then he heard a twig snap close by. It sounded like it came from inside the cemetery fencing. Then he heard the ruffling of leaves. He stopped and looked inside the cemetery, squinting to see what it could be. He heard one of the crows caw again, this time louder. Off at a slight distance, but unmistakable, he saw a woman with piercing eyes. He could see her eyes more than the rest of her. Her eyes seemed otherworldly. As she came closer to the iron fence, she smiled slowly. At first, she appeared sweet and innocent. He could see her lips parting into a sweet smile, and the white of her teeth peeked out. Her hair was big and disheveled, but maybe that was the style around here. As she came closer and into the moonlight, John Luke felt a sense of desperation emanate from her. It was unmistakable. She quickly reached her arm through the fence and grabbed his forearm. He instinctively pulled away from her, but felt a strength beyond her size and weight. Her nails had torn his outer coat sleeve into a few shreds, almost like a bear or an animal with talons. He had to use all his strength to pull away from her grip. He instinctively moved away from the fence and closer to the street. While still looking at her, she parted her lips further, and he saw two long fangs like those of a snake. Picking up his pace, he walked along the curb. He felt adrenaline rush through his system. His heart beat faster and his pulse rate went up. What he just saw triggered a fight or flight reaction. The incisors looked real, but the scientist in him knew there was no such thing as vampires. As he continued walking along the curb, he heard more rustling of leaves. He opened his cell phone and ordered an Uber ride. Maybe tonight was not such a good night for a walk in the night air, after all. As he waited for a few cars to pass to cross the street, he continued watching the woman inside the cemetery. She kept going in and out of the moonlight. Even when she walked back several feet from the fence, he still saw her. She used the trees as some kind of cover, but she was still moving in his direction. He felt hunted by her. Suddenly, a gloved hand reached around from behind her and covered her mouth. She managed to utter one tiny shriek, but was then silenced by the gloved hand. She was then dragged back into the shadows. He watched it all with unbelieving eyes. His Uber ride showed up, and he jogged across the street and got into the back seat. He hoped he would be re-entering reality at the same time. Christ the King Monastery. I know where that is, said the Uber driver. Are you one of the monks? He sighed a breath of relief at the normalcy behind the driver's question. I'm not a monk yet. I'm going there to discern whether I want to be a priest or a monk. I guess you can say I'm not 100% sure. Cool. My aunt is a nun. She lives in Florida in a convent down there, said the Uber guy. That's wonderful. The Lord needs priests and nuns. John Luke was calming down. The small talk reoriented him back into the real world. I guess he does. I used to go to church, but I fell away. Life's too busy, you know. Life is very busy. I just had a scare outside that cemetery, said John Luke. Some people say that the cemetery is haunted, but some say there's a bunch of goth kids that do weird, scary stuff, so who knows? Hopefully you'll be safe in the monastery, said the Uber guy, who looked in the rearview mirror waiting for a laugh. None came. The Uber driver dropped John Luke off at a mansion house with a circular driveway. After handing the driver a tip, John Luke got out and approached the front doors. He wasn't expecting such a luxurious mansion. He reached up and knocked using the metal lion's head knocker. Nothing. Right before he knocked a second time, the Uber driver left. He stood there thinking, what would the monks be doing that at least one of them can't answer the door? He texted his mother and grandmother, I arrived safely. Call you both when I can. He didn't know when he would get a chance to call or text them. He had no idea what the rules would be about cell phones or anything else. John Luke knocked again, this time a bit harder. The door opened wide, and there stood a beautiful young woman. She had long blonde hair that fell in long waves about 4 inches below her shoulders. Her big blue eyes opened wide, and she said, Are you a new monk? I've never seen you before. John Luke was speechless. Another attractive brunette woman in her 40s came up behind her and took over. Genevieve, invite the young man in. Come in out of the cold. I'm Elizabeth Reagan, and this is my daughter, Genevieve. Is this Christ the King Monastery? Asked John Luke. Well, it's not exactly the monastery, but the monastery is on our property behind the main house. Come in and sit down for a moment. I'm John Luke Cullen. He shook hands with both women. Have you been assigned to this monastery? Asked Mrs. Reagan. I'm coming for a period of discernment, said John Luke, as he saw Genevieve still looking at him. You're too young and handsome to enter the monastery. You should run and save yourself, said Genevieve as she smirked. John Luke smiled, and he could feel himself blushing. He wasn't used to the amount of female attention he had gotten in the last 20 minutes. He could barely handle it. He tried to get a grip on himself. My cousin Renee is the abbot there. Let me call him, and he can have one of the brothers come up and walk you back. It can be a little booby trapped in the dark. Elizabeth picked up the phone in the large reception room and called over to her cousin, Abbot Renee. Come in and have a quick brandy before they fully imprison you. I'm Patrick Reagan, Elizabeth's husband and Genevieve's father. He walked John Luke into the drawing room, and John Luke agreed to the brandy. Normally he would pass, but after seeing what appeared to be a vampiress, and now this beautiful woman, he went for the brandy. That would be great. It was a long journey. I took buses and trains up here from Florida, said John Luke. Genevieve had followed them into the drawing room. She walked along with her father. She included herself in the conversation between her dad and John Luke. She looked him up and down, and he felt it. That is quite a trip. You may need 2 brandies. He handed the half-filled brandy snifter to John Luke, who took it and gulped half of it down. Now, there's a man who likes a good brandy, said Patrick, grinning. Thank you. That felt good. He glanced at Genevieve, and he wanted to say something, but of course he was tongue-tied. But with her it didn't seem to matter. How old are you? She asked. I'm 24. How old are you? I'm 21. I would love to visit Florida. Okay, Genevieve, that's enough flirting with the new monks, said Patrick. Who's flirting? I'm being friendly and cordial. John Luke could tell she was hamming it up as she spoke. Patrick said, what can I say? She's impossible. God gives us all a cross to bear, and mine is my youngest daughter. I don't know what you could be talking about, said Genevieve, still performing. John Luke smiled at her. He knew his attraction to her showed through. He felt her dad's curiosity triggered by his interest. Patrick made small talk with John Luke and Genevieve for about 5 minutes. Then the doorbell rang. A moment later, Abbot Renee entered the room with Elizabeth. John Luke, I'm so glad you made it. I know you had a long trip. They shook hands. I see you've met the family. Yes, they were very welcoming. The Uber driver brought me here instead of the monastery. It happens all the time. Luckily, I'm related to the family. They are almost our official welcoming committee. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for the brandy, Mr. Reagan, said John Luke as he picked up his suitcase. Brother Rene was about to lead him outside again when Genevieve spoke. I might need to make a confession to someone young, so I'll come over one day, said Genevieve. Genevieve, stop teasing him, said her mother. Who's teasing? I should think you would be happy knowing I was going to make a good confession, continuing with her normal theatrics. She saw John Luke smile on his way out after hearing the remark. As she walked over to the staircase, she said over her shoulder, and he is too young and handsome for the monastery. Patrick, what are we going to do with her? Elizabeth shook her head, only half in jest. We've tried everything. I think an actual leash or maybe a cage is the only solution we have left, said Patrick with a tinge of sarcasm. I wonder where she gets the theatrics from, asked Elizabeth accusingly. I don't know what you're referring to, he replied with a mischievous grin. Abbot Rene led John Luke over through the Reagan property to the monastery. It was located on the Reagan property. One side of the monastery had a pathway that led to another road behind the estates. The abbot explained this was the road he needed to travel to enter their home. Once inside the monastery, Brother Rene whispered, in light of the fact you've been traveling all day, You should retire for the night. You can join the community in the morning. Don't feel it necessary to join us at midnight prayers." "I appreciate it. I'm exhausted," said John Luke. "I'm happy to have you with us for your period of discernment. I hope you choose to join us. You'll have 6 months to decide," said Abbot Rene. "I will need to decide in 3 months because there is a scholarship awaiting me if I should decide not to enter the community. I am hoping to discern in 3 months," said John Luke. "You've jogged my old memory. I do remember your letter explaining the circumstances of the scholarship. So you have 3 months to discern. Come this way, and I'll bring you to your cell." Abbot Rene walked John Luke to his room. It had a small bed, a small table, one chair, and 2 lamps. "So this is a cell," said John Luke. "This is a monk's cell, yes," said Abbot Rene, smiling. John Luke put his stuff on the floor, and Abbot Rene said, "Good night. We rise at 6 o'clock to start the day. We'll talk more about what to expect in the morning." "Thank you. Good night." John Luke looked around and saw there was no bathroom in the room. He reminded himself it wasn't a hotel. He remembered Abbot Rene pointing out a bathroom on their way to the cell, so he went there to wash up. As he prepared to go to bed, he glanced out the window in his room. He saw what appeared to be an outdoor garden and several groves of trees. He saw an old graveyard at a distance, but he already knew the monastery was next to a cemetery. It all looked peaceful and still. This would be a great place to find direction for his life. Then he saw something moving, but it was too dark to make out what it was. His first thought was of a black bear. Then the creature came into the moonlight for a moment, and he then realized it was a man. It was a monk, looking through binoculars over towards the cemetery. He seemed to be scanning the wooded area between the monastery grounds and the cemetery. He watched as the monk lowered the binoculars and walked into the wooded area and disappeared. As he undressed and prepared to get into bed, he went over the entire trip in his mind. It was a long and strange journey. He thought he saw his craziest sights when passing through the trains in New Jersey and New York, but nothing prepared him for what he saw in Newport, Rhode Island, and that cemetery. Not to mention a monk with binoculars walking into the cemetery at night. As he settled into bed, he thought, if I tell the abbot I saw a vampiress who tore my coat sleeve, he'll call the mental health authorities. He doesn't know me. It's what I or anyone else would do. I'll just file this under one heck of a strange night in Newport and leave it at that. He lay down in the bed and got comfortable. Within 2 minutes, he popped back up and set his alarm for 5:30 a.m. Then he fell back into bed and was out cold within 5 minutes. I have a link to read the rest of the ebook posted below this video. Please be aware that this book and the series is a text-only ebook. The graphics and audio are used only for this sample presentation. Thanks for listening.